In a world overrun with the fake, delusional, and disingenuous, he stands as a beacon of truth. He is Abuki Cabal. You are listening to Abuki Cabal.
Welcome to the Abuki Cabal Show.
What's going on, everybody? Been wanting to address this for a little while. I've been listening to a few other shows that have been, excuse me, digging into why black folks shouldn't support the Democratic Party. How do we ever start supporting the Democratic Party? Why are we voting for them at a 90% rate when we're getting nothing out of the deal? All those arguments. I just finished a show with Professor Black Truth on there and talking about how the Democratic Party hasn't been taking the black male vote seriously, which I agree with. But I'm seeing some TikTokers, and putting up a bunch of disingenuous, stuff, saying that Democrats are saying that the Republicans are going to put you back in chains and all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, they did show some sound bites, but showed Nancy Pelosi saying that basically that those southern states could use the growers in the southern states could use the immigrants who were coming there for work. It may not sound good, but it's true. Those people who are immigrating are coming here for work. And let's face it, they're coming here to do work that black folks don't want to do. Black folks think is beneath them. Black folks, if you ask them, hey, would you go out there and pick green beans and soybeans and cotton and whatever the case may be, would you go do that? And I guarantee you 90%, if not 100% of black folks would say they wouldn't do that. So I don't see why black folks are up in arms about Nancy Pelosi saying that, it's wrong for them to send, immigrants up to these other states. And it's not like when they send them up to these other states that they're going to be, somehow in a better situation. They're still going to have to deal with the same immigration policies as any other state in the United States. So when you have someone like, the governor of Florida shipping people from his state up to Martha's Vineyard, it's nothing more than a political stunt. He doesn't care anything about these people. He would do better sending them back to their country as opposed to sending them up to Martha's Vineyard where, hey, most of us can't go. Most of the people who are, who live in the United States can't just, go up to Martha's Vineyard and just hang out. Everybody knows that Martha's Vineyard has high class people there, people who earn, a certain amount of money. And he knows that those people tend to lean Democratic. So when he sends a bunch of people up there who have no place to go and just drop them off, but yet he says in his own state that he doesn't have enough money, to help folks, with voting or with schools or any of the ills that his state has with regard to shortfalls. So I don't understand how this is one, our issue. This has nothing to do with us, but we're jumping on board with it. You have, all these people saying vote for the Republican Party. Show me where the Republican Party has welcomed black folks with open arms and said, we're going to solve your problems. Yes, we will help with the schools. We will make sure that black men are being locked up. We'll stop them from being locked up at huge rates. We will ensure that black male issues are addressed. We'll ensure that there's we're going to stop the crime that's happening in your communities. Where are the Republicans, coming up with their policies for that? Matter of fact, go back even farther. Go back last 10 years, 20 years, and show me where they've supported anything that the majority of black folks supported. And I know what's going to come up. Okay, the crime bill. Okay, well, I was alive during that time, and I can tell you, I'm from Clinton's home state, and I can tell you that black folks here that was in his ear were demanding that something be done about the shooting, the robbing, the stealing, the dope selling. All of that was going on down here. And I know it was going on a lot worse in California, in Atlanta, in Texas. People were really getting down. And for people who weren't even alive during that time, coming back and saying that, hey, they locked up all of these people. I understand that they locked up all of these people, but you got to realize too that y'all wanting to hold the folks who are in the leadership positions accountable, but you don't want to hold the black community accountable for begging to lock up folks. Then you had another sector of the community that was basically saying that if you do this is going to be, an atrocity committed against black people. So there was both sides of the argument taking place, but black folks asked for that. So now you're having people who who we aligned with, and now you're basically turning your back on them instead of basically saying, okay, we made a mistake together. Now, what can we do to rectify that mistake now that we see in hindsight that this has taken place? Take accountability for it and fix the problem. The same person who wrote the bill, Joe Biden, should be sitting down with people today saying, okay, how can we rectify the situation? I made a mistake, But none of these white Republicans, they don't care. They made their money. I don't know if you know where, the side of the issue came from with regard to the private prison part, but I dare say that it didn't come from the Democrats. A lot of Republicans made a lot of money locking up black folks. And I'm sure some Democrats made some money too. That is the nature of the beast. But what we need to be talking about right now is what are we going to do right now to ensure that our issues are being addressed? Okay, by going to a party that is basically focused on every issue other than yours is not going to solve your problem. Okay, and let's look on the Democratic side. Okay, if white folks are running the agenda with the Democratic side, which I have a lot of issues with that, i.e., a lot of this pushing towards women's issues and gay issues as the paramount issues of our time, I don't agree with that. Okay, but the way to solve that is by black men showing up en masse with an alternative set of agendas that need to be addressed, i.e., Dr. Tiosan Johnson's plan that he has. If we showed up, 100,000 strong to the Democratic National Committee and said, this is what we want, then I don't see how we couldn't be recognized nationally for the issues that we bring to the table. Along with, if these issues are addressed, you will get our support. Because all they've heard now, before this, is women and gay folks coming to the table with their money, their support, and their time. That's why they're at the forefront of all these issues. Now look on the other side. Okay, you got Republicans over there. They won't even shake hands with the black folks who are in the spots over there in public. Anything that's black, they basically, made it look like it was children's mess during that time. I mean, it was all in your face. When he was campaigning, you had black folks being pushed out of his campaign rallies, attacked, spat on, called all kind of racial slurs. And then you have folks I want to make money, so I'm going to support Trump. And here you have a person who is sitting up here who is pretty much broken. If you had broken the same laws that this individual had broken, you'd be under the jail right now, if not executed. But everybody wants to turn a blind eye to it because they don't care. No one cares about anything. Our focus is in every different direction. It's in disarray. And he's putting so much misinformation on the table through people like Candace Owens, and these other players, the two Weave twins that they had on Fox News until they basically said the wrong thing and they got them out. All of the black folks who have aligned themselves with Trump and the Republican Party have been eating dirt. But you guys are still out here saying that we should support the Republican Party. And I'm not saying that we should be out here supporting the Democratic Party. I'm saying that if we want stuff to be done, we have a better chance at going to the table with our demands with the Democrats than we do with the Republicans. The Republicans have historically said, we don't care what you guys bring. We never supported y'all anyway. And, the Republicans support the gay agenda just as much as the Democrats do. They've never stood in the way of that since it's begun. They've got the evangelicals tricked into believing that, that they've got their back. But really, the only issue that evangelicals were concerned about was abortion. And they came through on that. OK, nobody's asking, what happens when we support these people? What's going to happen next? Are we prepared to deal with the outcomes if we support the Republicans en masse? So if you support them and they get back in, what are you going to get? We know that historically, the economy has done better under the Democrats than it has the Republicans for decades. Every time the Republicans get in and they run wild, raise taxes on the middle class, on lower classes, while reducing taxes on the rich and people who inherit large sums of money from their families. That's in order for them to maintain their riches and not have to pay taxes for anything. Now, most of the time, we don't fit into that. You have people out here with these fictitious beliefs that there are masses, that the median income in the United States is somehow $100,000. That's why we keep hearing $100,000 from all of these, these black females, $100,000. You should be able to make up $100,000. I'm watching the Lapeef Network and you got Anton on there saying that basically you should be able to make $100,000. People and you got, Kayla on there. Oh, people in my circle all make $100,000. This is in my environment. This is what the young folks are saying. These people really believe that anybody that wants to make $100,000 can make $100,000. I don't think these people are politically realistic. I think they only see what they want to see, which is their surrounding environment. I don't want to take anything away from Anton. I'm sure he's worked really hard to get where he is. But, as far as, his comments about other people and what the common man has to put up with, I don't think they're relevant. Same thing with Kayla. You have a person here wearing wigs every day, going out, living an unrealistic lifestyle. And then when she gives you an example of something that's supposed to be the average person's lifestyle, she brings up a reality TV show. And then brings up everybody in there is a business owner and they're this and they're that. And blah. She doesn't even have realistic, expectations about healthcare. what people have to pay for health care, for life insurance, for any of the things that the normal person has to put up with. You don't hear these people talking about things that are of any substance. Now, one of my recurring antagonists, Slick Rick, was in my comments, and Slick Rick says that, I don't know what I'm talking about, and pretty much, the Democrats this, the Democrats that. Let me pull this up so I can kind of share this with you guys. So Slick Rick says, please name me some bills that the Republicans voted down that the Democrats tried to put in place that would have benefited 90% of the country. I'll wait. I got one for you, Slick Rick. And that is the Affordable Care Act. That would have benefited 100% of Americans. And the Republicans gutted it. Everybody needs health insurance. Everybody needs health care. Why would you vote that down? Okay, he says that it's not true that the Democrats had a majority of seats in the South through the 90s. Even states like Georgia, Mississippi didn't get their first Republican governors until late 1990s to 2000. It's a straight lie that the party switched sides. A majority of the Klan members stayed with the Democratic Party. Even Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton won the South when they ran for president. You can look at the governors and senators elected in the South and even see that the Democrats dominated the seats in the South up to the 90s. Okay. So he's telling me that the Southern strategy is a myth. Well, that brings me to the topic of my show. As you can see here, I've got 3 articles up here, one by the History Channel, one by PolitiFacts, and one by a history professor here in the state of Arkansas who was on the panel with Candace Owens when she was testifying before the Senate about the Southern strategy and about the racism that black folks have to endure in the South. Okay? So we're gonna go through some of those. And you guys tell me what you think down in the comments. Because, we deal with facts, data, and statistics over here. So let's take a look. We're going to go back in time. Now, here we go. We're going to discuss the Southern strategy is a myth. Candace Owens said, quote unquote, Candace Owens, false statements that the Southern strategy is a myth. Okay. Take a listen to that and see what you guys think. Here we go.
False statement that the Southern strategy is a myth. During a congressional hearing on hate crimes, conservative African-American commentator Candace Owens said that the Republican Party never had a strategy of capitalizing on racism to lure voters. Owens said that black conservatives face criticism from the left because they have the audacity to think for ourselves and become educated about our history and the myth of things, like the Southern switch and the Southern strategy, which never happened. The Southern strategy refers to efforts by the Republican Party to appeal to Southern white voters who were turned off by the Democratic Party advocating for civil rights. Historians disputed her statement, including Cornell professor Lawrence Glickman and University of Arkansas professor Angie Maxwell. Princeton historian Kevin Cruz called Owens' statements utter nonsense. Owens is a spokesperson for the conservative nonprofit Turning Point USA and encourages black people to leave the Democratic Party, calling it Blexit. Owens did not respond to our emailed request for comment. On Twitter, she said she was referring to the myth that the Republicans and Democrats in Congress switch parties. Cruz challenged her explanation, saying, Owens, predictably, points to the small number of congressmen who switch parties as proof that the larger literature on the racial realignment is a myth. Even though that isn't actually something historians and political scientists emphasize in the work on this. The Republican Southern strategy has been documented for decades, including by Republicans who were a part of it. The facts about the Southern strategy. For this fact check, we interviewed historians and reviewed news articles from the Civil Rights era. Joseph Alsop, an influential syndicated newspaper columnist, called it basically a segregationist strategy in a 1962 column. When Republican Barry Goldwater ran for president in 1964, his Southern surrogates played up the fact that he had just voted against the Civil Rights Act. That paid off in the Deep South, where he won a handful of states, but he ultimately lost to Lyndon B. Johnson. By 1968, the Republicans fine-tuned their approach and packaged it in a way they could win, said Maxwell, the Arkansas professor and an expert on Southern politics. Republican nominee Richard Nixon reached out to white Southerners by opposing school busing and promising that his administration would not ram anything down your throats and would appoint strict constructionist Supreme Court justices.
Okay. Strict constructionist Supreme Court justices. Does that seem familiar to anybody? This was when the efforts to start to take over the court began. So as you can see right now, I mean, even with looking at what's going on with voting right now and what's going on in Georgia, you know, the Republicans have already said, they said it publicly, they'll put up, Bobo the Clown if he'll just basically vote the same way as all the other Republicans are going to vote. And they don't care who they're going to put up. They don't care what they've done. They don't care what kind of political problems that they may have. As long as they're going to vote in lockstep with the rest of the Republicans, they don't care, because their objective is, they've already won the courts. So now their objective is to win the House. And if they have the House, the Senate, and the courts, and then after that, the presidency, there is nothing that they have to, there's nothing you can offer them. There's nothing that you're going to be able to come and say, hey, do this for me. They're not going to have any incentive to do anything for anybody other than what they want to do. And to understand this, you have to understand how things go as far as trying to instill political pressure in order to get policies passed. You can't put any kind of pressure on anyone on any side that has all of the seats locked up. You got the judiciary, you got the executive branch, and you got the Senate and the House. They don't have to listen to anybody. Okay? They've used all their power to basically obstruct everything that the Democrats have tried to do ever since going back to Clinton. This has been their strategy. They openly came out and said that no matter what Obama was doing once he got elected, that they were going to basically try to obstruct it and keep it from happening. Before they ever even met the man, they vowed not to work with him. So how do you go and try to negotiate with a person who is adamant that they're going to deal with you in bad faith? You look at that in any aspect of your life. If you're, trying to get into school and you're doing everything that's expected of you, and you turn that in, and then they say, well, you're still not going. How do you get around that? How do you, negotiate something that is going to be, that's already going to be shot down before you have even, fulfill the requirements to get through the door? But people out here, a lot of black folks, pretty much just, they don't care about any of this and how any of this works, but let's move on and break down this history a little bit more, because this is hard to refute, and I keep hearing that the Southern strategy was a myth, and you see where it came from. It came from an empty-headed individual by the name of Candace Owens, who has now repackaged herself as a semi-ally to the Black manosphere, talking about family issues, and people are willing to give her a pass this quick.
The strongest evidence of the Southern strategy comes directly from Republicans at the time. That includes Clarence Towns, who served as director of the Minorities Division of the Republican National Committee in the 1960s. Harvard professor Leah Wright Rieger wrote about Towns in her book The Loneliness of the Black Republican, by John Greenberg, September 23, 2022. When Nixon disbanded the division, Towns told reporters in 1970, "There's a total fear of what's called the Southern strategy. Blacks understand that their well-being is being sacrificed to political gain. There has to be some moral leadership from the president on the race question, and there just hasn't been any." In 1969, Nixon White House aide Lamar Alexander, who now represents Tennessee in the U.S. Senate, wrote about the Southern strategy in a memo following the unsuccessful Supreme Court nomination of Clement Haynesworth, who was opposed by civil rights groups. Southern strategy: "We flat out invited the kind of political battle that ultimately erupted when we named a Democrat turned Republican conservative from South Carolina. This confirmed the Southern strategy just at a time when it was being nationally debated," Alexander wrote. Nixon strategist Kevin Phillips openly discussed the Southern strategy in a newspaper article in 1973. If the new Washington liberal crowd could tear themselves away from Watergate ecstasy and the lionizing of Daniel Ellsberg for a little look-see below the Mason-Dixon line, they might glean a useful political insight, namely that the GOP Southern strategy seems to be rolling along and rolling up local victories, just as if G. Gordon Liddy had never existed. Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers in 1971 while Liddy was an FBI agent convicted of illegal wiretapping. Phillips told the New York Times in 1970 that the Republicans were never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. "The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans," he wrote. "That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangement with the local Democrat."
Now, isn't that interesting? They only need 10 to 20% of the Negro vote. And that's probably still true to this day. All they have to do is basically bamboozle the ones who basically don't have enough sense to read or to study any of the historical events that took place, any of the strategy that Republicans have been using for the longest. And it's still the same states, the very same states that that seceded the Union first. The core Confederate states are still acting the same way they've always acted. And black voters are still at the mercy of these people through gerrymandering, misinformation. And, the business as usual. So, we look here. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans, he wrote. Okay? So they knew what was going on. They knew it. They mapped it out. So while everybody else is looking, in the other direction, they knew exactly what was going on. And it's still going on now because I'm still hearing ignorant black folks say the same stuff now. So he wrote, that's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangements with local Democrats. So they basically won over all of the racist white folks to the Republican Party because everybody knew what was going on except for us. And those of us who know what's going on and we're telling people, they're saying that we basically just, we're in line with the white folks. We're just allowing, you just voting for the white folks and they ain't giving you nothing. This is coming from the same folks that don't show up at any meetings, don't go and put anything, any demands before the Democrats. that they've supported forever. They just think that if they just go vote, that's the end and the limits of their participation. Short-sighted and ignorant. Let's move on.
Ultimately, winning over white Southern voters required using coded language. As campaign consultant Lee Atwater, who worked on Reagan's 1980 campaign, explained in an interview 1981. In audio, he can be heard describing how in 1954, a racial slur could be used to describe Black Americans, but that backfired by 1968, requiring a pivot to use more abstract language. So you say stuff like, forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is, blacks get hurt worse than whites, he said. Reagan used language.
There you go. There it is. Laid out. Plain and simple. All you have to do is just befuddle them with new language. You know, long as you don't out and out call them niggas, it ain't gonna matter much. You know, you just willy-nilly the language. And that's what they do. They're still doing it now. You got black folks on here talking about states' rights. Black folks on YouTube talking about states' rights. Everybody down south knows what states' rights mean. And the very people who are up here talking about how good black folks can do are from places where they've never had to deal with the type of overt racism that takes place down south. Whether they like it or not, down south's political environment and the rest of the United States is totally different. It's alien. You know, move down here making $100,000 at whatever you do and move down to one of these states down here and make $100,000. Remake yourself, recreate yourself, and show us how easy it is to make $100,000. You know, you do that on YouTube. Hey, I'll more than break my neck to try to support you in your efforts. But we all know that that's not what's happening here. You know, this economy is based on workers more so than people who are sitting up, you know, being business owners and becoming, you know, makeup people and you know, selling eyelashes and catering companies and all of this stuff that you see black folks doing, you know, or whatever they're doing in Atlanta. You know, Atlanta is not the rest of the United States. You know, but hey, just like Kevin said, winter is coming. I can't wait to see it. So the reality sets in on some of these people so they can get their heads out of the sand and stop thinking that just because they have money that they're above the fray. But let's move on.
Language such as states' rights and welfare queens, which critics said was coded racist language. The partisan shift in the South from the 1960s to George W. Bush is the greatest partisan shift in all of American history, Maxwell said. In 2005, Republican National Committee Chairman Ken Mehlman told the NAACP National Convention in Milwaukee that using race as a wedge issue was wrong. By the 70s and into the 80s and 90s, the Democratic Party solidified its gains in the African American community, and we Republicans did not effectively reach out. Some Republicans gave up on winning the African American vote, looking the other way or trying to benefit politically from racial polarization. I'm here today as the Republican chairman to tell you we were wrong. Our ruling. Owen said the Southern strategy is a myth that never happened. Efforts by the Republican Party starting in the 1960s to win over white Southern voters have been documented by scholars for decades. The strongest evidence that it happened comes from the Republicans who were a part of that strategy. There are numerous instances of them talking about the approach in documents or interviews. We rate this statement false. Share the facts. Candace Owens. The Southern strategy is a myth that never happened. Tuesday, April 9, 2019.
So there you have it. So Miss Owens lied. She lied to other black folks, to her people, in order to fatten her pockets and get in to the good graces of our now disgraced ex-president, Trump. And a bunch of y'all fell for it because there wasn't as much of this talk going on before. You know, before she went out there and started licking and lapping, you know, at the feet of these Republicans for a job, which never came. She was never graced with a job or a position for all her efforts. But we're not going to stop there, folks. Not going to stop there. And I'm going to hold Candace Owens accountable to the day she dies, or she flips the scripts and start doing real work for black folks. Here's another article. This one's from the History Channel on the very same topic. How the party of Lincoln won over the once Democratic South. Okay, let's touch on that.
How the party of Lincoln won over the once Democratic South. Democratic defectors, known as the Dixiecrats, started a switch to the Republican Party in a movement that was later fueled by a so-called Southern strategy. Becky Little. Updated. April 10, 2019. Original. August 18, 2017. The night that Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. His special assistant Bill Moyers was surprised to find the president looking melancholy in his bedroom. Moyers later wrote that when he asked what was wrong, Johnson replied, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." It may seem a crude remark to make after such a momentous occasion, but it was also an accurate prediction. To understand some of the reasons the South went from a largely Democratic region to a primarily Republican area today, just follow the decades of debate over racial issues in the United States. The Republican Party was originally founded in the mid-1800s to oppose immigration and the spread of slavery, says David Goldfield, whose new book on American politics, The Gifted Generation, When Government Was Good, comes out in November. The Republican Party was strictly a sectional party, meaning that it just did not exist in the South, he says. The South couldn't care less about immigration, but it did care about preserving slavery. After the Civil War, the Democratic Party's opposition to Republican Reconstruction legislation solidified its hold on the South. The Democratic Party came to be more than a political party in the South. It came to be a defender of a way of life, Goldfield says. And that way of life was the restoration as much as possible of white supremacy. The Confederate statues you see all around were primarily erected by Democrats. Up until the post-World War II period, the party's hold on the region was so entrenched that Southern politicians usually couldn't get elected unless they were Democrats. But when President Harry S. Truman, a Democratic Southerner, introduced a pro-civil rights platform at the party's 1948 convention, a faction walked out. These defectors, known as the Dixiecrats, held a separate convention in Birmingham, Alabama. There, they nominated South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, a staunch opposer of civil rights, to run for president on their state's rights ticket. Although Thurmond lost the election to Truman, he still won over 1 million popular votes. It was the first time since before the Civil War that the South was not solidly Democratic, Goldfield says. And that began the erosion of the Southern influence in the Democratic Party.
Okay. Now, what do you think all those Dixiecrats who switched sides, what do you think that they were doing during that time? Do you think that they were inside the Democratic Party just being quiet, or do you think that they were just spreading their roots out? I mean, I don't understand how people can't connect the dots after the evidence is presented to anticipate the moves on the chessboard. But let's move on.
After that, the majority of the South still continued to vote Democratic because it thought of the Republican Party as the party of Abraham Lincoln and Reconstruction. The big break didn't come until President Johnson, another Southern Democrat, signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Though some Democrats had switched to the Republican Party prior to this, the defections became a flood after Johnson signed these acts, Goldfield says. And so the political parties began to reconstitute themselves. The change wasn't total or immediate. During the late 1960s and early 70s, white Southerners were still transitioning away from the Democratic Party. Newly enfranchised black Southerners voted and continue to vote Democratic. And even as Republican Richard Nixon employed a Southern strategy that appealed to the racism of Southern white voters, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, who'd wanted segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, ran as a Democrat in the 1972 presidential primaries. By the time Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, the Republican Party's hold on white Southerners was firm. Today, the Republican Party remains the party of the South. It's an ironic outcome considering that a century ago, white Southerners would have never considered voting for the party of Lincoln.
Okay. So there you have it. More evidence of what took place. And that's a short, sweet kind of snippet. And we're going to move on to another article. And this one is from Princeton Economics. I don't want to do that one first. I will do this one. And this is, well, it speaks for itself. Here we go.
Political scientist Angie Maxwell on Countering the Long Southern Strategy by Benjamin Barber, January 22, 2021. Dr. Angie Maxwell, a historian at the University of Arkansas, recently spoke with Facing South about the long history of the Southern strategy, the topic of her latest book, and the future of politics in the South after the 2020 elections. Photo via the University of Arkansas. For decades, the Republican Party has used what's known as the Southern strategy to win white support in the region through dog whistle appeals to racism, sexism, and Christian nationalism. Facing South recently spoke with political scientist Dr. Angie Maxwell, co-author with Todd Shields of The Long Southern Strategy: How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics, about the deep history of political division in the region and the future of Southern politics after Democrats won the presidential election in Georgia for the first time in 28 years and defeated 2 Republican Senate incumbents in the state. Maxwell is the director of the Diane Blair Center of Southern Politics and Society, an associate professor of political science, and holder of the Diane Blair Endowed Professorship in Southern Studies at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. This interview has been condensed and edited for clarity. Can you explain what you mean by the long Southern strategy and the role it played in the evolution of the Republican Party? What we think about the Southern strategy in general. I sometimes call that the short Southern strategy because it helps me distinguish it. The short Southern strategy that most people know goes something like this. As the National Democratic Party started to embrace civil rights post-New Deal, but really in the 1960s, the Republican Party, or some strategists in it, saw an opportunity to win some Southern white voters who felt like the National Democratic Party was moving very far away from the Democratic Party they knew or what their state Democratic Party was. There starts to be this big gap. After the 1964 Civil Rights Act is signed, the Republican Party at their convention that summer is really divided between the Rockefeller Republicans, who are moderately pro-civil rights, and a growing, primarily Midwestern, anti-labor conservative wing of the party. The party did a lot of work in the late 1950s and early 60s to try to find a nominee that they could push for. They finally found one, Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, who'd been one of the few Republican senators to not sign the Civil Rights Act. Goldwater became a star in the Republican Party and the Republican nominee in 1964. Southern Democrats who were upset with the National Democratic Party, like Strom Thurmond in South Carolina, changed their party ID to Republican, and really only stumped for Goldwater and pitched Goldwater Republicanism as a counter to this increasingly liberal Democratic Party. Goldwater succeeds in flipping 5 Southern states: Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. He earned 87% of the vote in Mississippi, which is one of the most radical changes in all of American political history. Goldwater only wins those 5 Southern states and his state of Arizona and loses the rest of the country. But that moment was the first time the Republican Party became a real viable option in the Deep South, at least at the presidential level. There wasn't much structure underneath that. There wasn't a strong Republican Party statewide, so it took a little more time. Nixon comes along 4 years later and manages to build on what Goldwater did, but maybe not saying it so aggressively.
And see, what she left out on this was that, Goldwater, and this was brought up in the some of the other articles, is that Goldwater basically was portrayed as not supporting civil rights legislation for black people. That's why he won those southern states, and that's important to put out there. So let's move on.
For the South goes red. That's the story we tell. The problem with that is nothing is that simple. We forget that Nixon is successful, but in 1976 Jimmy Carter runs as a Democrat and wins the entire South back except for one state, Virginia. Republicans have to go back to the drawing board and think of other issues that appeal to Southern whites. There are two things in this next phase of what I call the long Southern strategy. They really adapted their coded racial language to fit the moment.
And there you go, Slick Rick. Carter did not win the entire South. He won most of it. He didn't win the entire South, though, so you're wrong on that as well.
Which in the 80s became a pitch towards colorblindness. Doesn't sound like a bad thing, but it's really a denial of structural racism. And then into fiscal conservatism, but not on everything. Just on social programs that were aimed at leveling the racial playing field, so to speak, or welfare reform issues. The other thing that they did in rebranding the party in the Southern image, to earn these Southern white voters and cut themselves an electoral path to victory, is that they adopted a Southern style of politics, which is the politics of entertainment and big rallies, spectacle kind of politics, a real distrust of media, and us versus them politics. They pull some kind of George Wallace.
Now you see the origins of the type of campaigning that you saw Trump doing. Big spectacles, dog whistle politics, big rallies. You see this? So you see all of this, even this making America great again, all of that's rooted in racist undertones, racist historical positions that he knew he could use to win the South. And he's made them into a fervor of support for him because he looks like the old South, the old Southern politician. Let's move on. And they ain't supporting him because he's for everybody.
Instead of defining yourself by what you are, you define yourself by what you're not. Sometimes they call that positive polarization. So it took a much longer Southern strategy to rebrand the party. And they rebranded it in these elements of Southern whiteness. They nationalized that. Now, it's not that those elements aren't anywhere else in the country. We know they are, but not at the level of concentration they are among Southern whites. But they speak to it, and it becomes the rebranded Republican Party. In the book you argue that the Southern strategy was not only rooted in racism but was deeply influenced by the rise of gender equality and the GOP's alliance with the Southern Baptist Convention. Can you explain how the elements of race, gender, and religion were combined to formulate the Republican Party's strategy? As political scientists, we used to measure racism using a scale called old-fashioned racism, which was basically racial stereotypes. People would rank whites or blacks on work ethic and trustworthiness. After the civil rights movement, all those numbers start to look like maybe things are different. Maybe some of the old-fashioned racism was diminishing. But it's more that respondents didn't want to say those things anymore. So new scales were developed looking at symbolic racism, which really got at the idea that structural racism didn't exist, that we shouldn't have affirmative action programs, that generations in slavery and Jim Crow did not have a long-term effect on upward mobility, politically and economically, all that.
Okay, so how now you see the move from overt racism to covert racism. So that's what we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with people who really don't want to say how they feel. I'm not a racist. I support, all people, and I like this and I like that. And if a black person works just as hard as a white person, yeah, they should have that. Or if all of that stuff that they say down here, we know they're lying. But it seems like the rest of the black folks in the country don't know the difference between when these these folks are lying to them or not. We know, we can look at them and we can tell that they're lying when they say, oh yeah, that's great that, there were so many black doctors got into the medical program this time. We know what that means. That means the next time, I bet y'all black asses will not be in here. I bet you that. And it happens every single time. But you expect us to believe that, no, this was just a fluke. This was some group of unfortunate circumstances that we should just look over. It was just something that just happened. These things just fell into place. No. This is a strategy. And we better start getting smart as black people, or it's going to continue to happen. The reason why everybody's all mad and saying we need to switch sides and switch and report and do these parties is because they have been effective in blocking all positive movement in a direction that we would see as beneficial. Let's move on.
The Republican Party realized it was going to have to adapt its racial appeal. It couldn't go do what George Wallace did. You couldn't even say the things Nixon and Strom Thurmond said. It wasn't going to work. It might win you some voters in pockets in the South, but you're going to lose the country. You've got to code it better. Then they also started looking to see what other issues could help break up these Southern blocs. Southern white women started changing their party ID from Democrat to Republican much later. We sometimes see that the racialized appeal works for one faction of white women kind of at an extreme end. But what about the more moderate conservative women? When the equal rights...
There you go. So as you see, even more movement to the Republicans. And the movement was because of the language, the coded language. The coded language which conveyed, we don't like these black folks. We don't like anything that these black folks are doing. We feel like that shouldn't have been done. They moved too fast in segregation and all of that. You even got some people down here saying, that, segregation is not necessarily a bad thing. That basically, hey, maybe we should put black folks over across town and then we be over here on this side. But we see the effects of segregation in the South already. That's why your water systems on the black side of town ain't worth a damn. That's why your internet access is trash on the black side of town. That's why all of your public utilities are trash and haven't been maintained. And then when something radical needs to be done, they want to increase your taxes even more. Just on you, not on everybody, but just on you, the folks who live there. I mean, you look at the situation in Michigan, still hasn't been fixed. We've had 2 presidents since then, and it still hasn't been fixed. Why is that? That's a national emergency. If you had a politician that was really interested in trying to change these things, all they have to do is just mobilize the military, mobilize the Corps of Engineers, and go in there and I want this fixed. I don't want it fixed, yesterday. I mean, I want it fixed. Right now, I want all available effort. I want to recruit as many people as we have to recruit to get up there, as many plumbers as we need to get this taken care of. There's no reason why an American state should have water systems the equivalent to someplace over in the Middle East. But we're not doing that. We don't put an all hands on deck type approach into effect when things like this happen in America. Now we got the same situation happening again in another state down south. And still nothing is done. You look at what happened, what happened down in New Orleans with the mobilization down there. All they had to do was mobilize the military. I've been a part of military efforts that were mobilized to go and help other countries. But I didn't see that same mobilization happen to help New Orleans. So they can do what they want to do. But the message is clear from the Republicans, and that is we are anti-black.
Rights Amendment was on a trajectory to be approved by enough states to amend the Constitution. The anti-ERA movement really went after Southern white women, because the Southern states were the states where they thought the ERA would have the best chance of failing because they're the same states that had not ratified the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage. So if you're a strategist for the anti-ERA group and you're going, where might we kill this thing? You're looking at places where the 19th Amendment wouldn't pass in 1920. And when they started talking to Southern white women, they really misrepresented the ERA. They realized that Southern white women had been politicized by the anti-feminist movement led by Phyllis Schlafly, and then other movements like WWWW, Women Who Want to Be Women, founded by Texas native Lottie Beth Hobbs, and efforts from the Southern Baptist Convention to portray feminism as a threat to traditional gender roles. We're starting to understand a little bit more about what happened. We talk about religion and Republicans and Southern politics, and we talk about race, but the bridging the middle was the anti-ERA movement. It was one of their big sells. It's family.
Okay. Now this I kind of agree with them on, because this did dismantle traditional gender roles. So we see in retrospect that yes, the ERA movement and feminist movements have destroyed traditional gender roles, and it's having a catastrophic effect right now. Okay, so that issue, it's beginning to show. The data is beginning to show up that was bad. Okay, there is no such data regarding their efforts to shoot down civil rights agendas being a good thing for the country, but yet they persisted. Okay, let's move on.
Values. The Republican Party finds it works. It helps them strengthen that growing allegiance with the Southern Baptist Convention and evangelicals and social conservatives. In the 2000s, for example, you see Republican strategists putting gay marriage amendments on ballots in states to really pull evangelicals to the polls, giving them much more of a place within the party. It's important to know that they had to do all three of those things, because it turns out a lot of people are just one of those three. When we measure racial resentment and modern sexism, which is a measure of just anti-feminism and Christian nationalism, there are some people that are all three, but a lot of people are two of three or one of three. It's just not enough that are all three, so it really takes that whole trifecta to define a new party brand. It creates such a...
So there you see it. Okay? So they lined up the dots so that if everybody didn't align with all of their ideas, then we'll get the ones who align with all of our ideas, but the other ones who just align with one or two of the ideas, we'll get them too and bolster our numbers to further our agenda. So here you're seeing that the strategy is laid out, and the strategy wasn't a fast thing that was going to take place. They mapped this out for decades. So let's move on.
Brand in the Republican Party that anybody who can come in and get those three elements the best can play to that hard right in a crowded field in a Republican primary. In 2016, Southern states move up their primaries. So whoever plays to those three things most effectively can gain quite a bit of momentum in the race for the Republican nomination. How has this strategy been used, specifically the race component, to trick many white Southerners into voting against their own interests? There's a couple of elements of that. First, that was not new for the Republican Party to do that. That long history of white elites in the South building an alliance with poor whites in order to suppress any kind of class-based politics led to the suppression of the populist uprisings in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and had really squashed any kind of labor union organizing in the region and led to the development of the right-to-work states. Even some of Jim Crow and the...
And when I told you guys about right-to-work states, that really means right to fire. They can fire you for any reason down here. They don't like you. They don't like the way you look. You're black, you're white, you're gay, whatever the case may be, they can fire you. And this is a part of the strategy. They laid it all out. So this is the Republicans truly playing chess. And you have other folks on the other side wishing and hoping that the goodness in people will prevail. So let's move on.
The way it was set up was an effort to give poor whites some seeming advantage, even in their poverty. We tend to think of it sometimes as just white elites. But Jim Crow was set up to make sure poor whites sided with elite whites, instead of siding with or building a common bond of politics or organizing with poor blacks. Slavery's over, so they create a new system that puts the voters they need on one side and African Americans on the other. And that made poor whites feel like they had something, that they were better than somebody. When people have possibilities to rise economically, it doesn't work as well, creating these kinds of faux hierarchies. But when people don't, when people have no opportunity to rise, then those faux hierarchies become more meaningful. The Southern white elites knew that, and they were able to set that up. There's a long history we often forget. We tend to look at poor whites who vote against their economic self-interest and say they're irrational, right? But we're basing that on what political scientists say rational voting is, which is you vote based on your economic self-interest. But for some people, no matter what the government does, it doesn't feel like it gets better. For some of those who are lowest income, in rural areas where there is not opportunity, they don't see this changing that much in their life. So they become rational identity voters, is what I call it in the book. Who do I feel like gets me? Who do I feel like would fight for me? It's irrational only if we look at bottom line and pocketbook policy issues. It's not necessarily irrational if we look at identity values and political emotions. You argue that the Southern strategy was used to nationalize Southern white identity and fundamentally altered American politics as a whole. What role did the Southern strategy play in producing the GOP's base of voters that supported Donald Trump? What we see is over the last 40 years, on measures of racial resentment and modern sexism and Christian nationalism, is the American people have sorted themselves. That doesn't happen in one election cycle. It doesn't even happen in a few. It takes a long time. What's happened is people have moved and sorted themselves as the parties took these polar positions, and the Republicans did that specifically to break up the electoral bloc in the South. The consequences of it are that people have sorted themselves over time to which brands they feel closer to. Now, what was a strategy to break up a few Southern states has rebranded the party in a way in which Republicans who don't express racial resentment and modern sexism and Christian nationalism are in the minority in their party and have a really hard time controlling it. And Trump played it really hard, coming after Obama, which also caused a major sorting effect.
Okay, we'll stop it there for a second. So, yes, there are good Republicans. Yes, there are, but they are in the minority. And I mean, I've got a lifelong friend who's a Republican right now. He's disgusted by the party, and the way in which it's moving. And you have a lot of Republicans here, just like it says in this article here, where she states that Republicans who don't express racial resentment and modern sexism and Christian nationalism are in the minority in their party and have a really hard time controlling it. That is why they went after Liz Cheney. That's why she's been ousted from the party, because she's still able to do the right thing. She's still able to basically govern without not listening to the other side, not debating, not negotiating over bills to get the best bill on the floor. So government as we know it is not working as it was intended. There is no debate. There is no back and forth. There is no cooperation. There's only one side must win out and be superior over the other. So what you're going to have effectively is a monarchy without a monarchy, if that takes place, which was supposed to be, according to the founding fathers, something that would never happen the way this is written up. But that was only if you had people with good sense on both sides of the party. But now they've already said, look, we don't care. We'll put up anybody we can. We'll put up Herschel Walker up there and we'll paint his face black. Doesn't make a difference. We'll make him look like Bobo the Clown, and he can say whatever. But all the Republicans are saying they're going to vote for him anyway, because they know that Herschel's going to do what they tell him to do. And black folks out here feel comfortable with that. I'm hearing black folks say, hey, this is great. I mean, if you look at Herschel Walker up there running this campaign and you feel good about that, that's not even in my state and I don't feel good about it. It is painful to watch. Let's move on.
And running against a woman. That on top of the 40 years of partisan sorting in this long Southern strategy grew a Trump base that is more vocal and more extreme. Trump could be that extreme in 2016 because he was coming after the first black president and because he was running against a woman. How was former President Trump's influence?
So there you go. The resentment after having to endure the first black president. I mean, a lot of people, you guys don't know. You guys act like you don't know anyway. You didn't feel, the discontent, hate and discontent in the air. I'm from the South. I felt it. Now, I don't know where you guys are from. I don't know if you could be honest with yourself, but I felt it. Everything changed after he became president. As I knew it would. I didn't vote for him the first time around because I knew anytime a black person gets in charge in a historic position, things are going to happen. They're going to say he embezzled money. They're going to say he did something terribly wrong to where his whole, anything associated with him historically is going to be crapped upon. That's always the case. Even you look in local politics down south, you'll see that, okay, when black folks get in charge, there's always something wrong with the money. They're going to say he tried to steal. He tried to do all these, he didn't do anything for his people. He was only out for the black folks, whatever. There's going to be something that they use to besmirch the person's name and his reputation, no matter how good the person is. And you see this across the board. Across the board, you see they do these things and they use this coded language. And black folks are not getting smarter. It seems like we're getting dumber and dumber because some of the things that we're falling for, we didn't even fall for back in the 60s. But we're supposed to be more highly educated today. But the affect is flat. No one really cares. Everybody just wants to make money and they just want things to just be taken care of without them putting forth any kind of effort. And we become lazy. I did a show earlier where I said, have we become too comfortable to bring about the change that's necessary for our community to grow and to prosper? And I think we have, because we all got jobs. You got people out here thinking everybody make $100,000 a year. Got people out here worrying about luxury. They don't even see it. They're wrapped up in a fairy tale world where they believe that everything is okay and that they don't have to go out and protest or do anything about anything. I'm not a marching guy. I'm not one of those guys. I'm not one of those super churchy guys either. But I'm saying that there has to be effort in order to elicit change. And we have become far too complacent and far too comfortable to do any of that. Because we all just, we're doing good and we don't really care, So let's move on.
Inflammatory rhetoric and exploitation of the Southern strategy connected with the recent violent attack on the U.S. Capitol. I think it's directly related. I don't think a lot of Trump's language is coded. Trump really uncoded it. He was coming after 8 years of a Democrat. And it's pretty common historically for things to flip after 8 years. There's also the rise of cable news and talk radio, just this perfect storm. Trump was able to go that far because people had sorted themselves accordingly. Because he didn't have to code it very much. He speaks louder and clearer to people for whom the dog whistle wouldn't work because they didn't quite hear it or didn't know what it meant.
There you go. The rise of misinformation and propaganda. Both of those things usually are used by militaries to get people to basically give up, to surrender. So he used it to basically bolster his troops, to strengthen their resolve. Let's move on.
But when he says it explicitly, it can draw in whole other crowds. I know it's the first time people have breached the Capitol, but when I think about the history in the South of massive resistance, when I think about governors blocking doorways and civil rights workers getting beaten to death, people getting beaten on the bridge in Alabama, dogs being turned on people, people being assassinated, mob violence is nothing new in the South. You mentioned the history of racial violence in the South. I think that the South has a duality about it that continues to impact politics in the region. This history of progressive movements and then this history of discrimination and division. What are some of the misconceptions about the South that you find yourself battling in your work? Well, first and foremost, there's not one South, right? There's a slightly higher percentage of whites in the South who call themselves Southern, but it is barely more than African Americans who call themselves Southern. I wrote a piece on that years ago in Southern Cultures called The Duality of the Southern Thing, about how the label does not belong to whites, and looking at what, if anything, there is in common between blacks and whites who call themselves Southern, or is it just a completely divergent identity? There was a little bit in common that had to do with a sense of family and a sensitivity to criticism, like the South's always behind, not cosmopolitan. But other than that, it's really different, so you've got to be very specific about what South you're talking about, what Southern you mean, because it isn't a label that belongs exclusively to whites. I wrote a piece for 538 right before the primaries in March talking about the difference between being a Southern Democrat and a Democrat who's part of the South. The Democratic Party in the South, in many Southern states, has got a long history of being run by African American women. And African American men too, but African American women more so. They take into consideration these racial politics as they choose their candidates.
Okay, shout out to BGS on that one. As we can see, the matriarchal leadership model is being talked about here in this. Black American women running the South, have always run the South. Long history of it. Here it is right here. Let's move on.
So they're pragmatists because they are very conscious of the racial politics that play within their state. That is a more complex political vision that I think most people misconstrue. So they tend to have a much more sophisticated and nuanced and multi-level assessment going on about the long march to progress. Earlier this month, Democrats were able to win the presidential election and flip 2 U.S. Senate seats in Georgia, a state that for years was known as a Republican stronghold. Do you take this as a sign that the Southern strategy is beginning to collapse? I think that progressives in Georgia have realized that they can counter it. It is different in every state. Some states you've got to win people over who are moderate Republicans. Some states you don't. Some states you have 50% of your electorate doesn't even turn out. In some it's urbanization, in some it's immigration, and in some it is disenfranchisement issues. I think Georgia looked and said, where can we build a coalition of all folks? I feel like they were very clear in what they were running against. But they also were saying a lot about what they're running for, right? It wasn't just run people over who once supported Trump or once supported Republican Senator David Perdue or once supported Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler. They painted a new vision and built a broad coalition. They reached out to rural voters, rural African American voters. And they said, if anyone tries to take away your vote, we're here, and we're going to fight for it. They empowered people. What does that mean for the future of Southern politics? This time around, I think what's happening is real development of strong two-party competition. I think you see that in North Carolina. I think you see that in Georgia. I think you're starting to see that in Texas. I think you see that in Virginia. And not just a flip from one to the other, that's the difference. What happened with realignment is the parties flipped. What's happening now is a growing, strong two-party system in some of those states. That is the best thing that could happen in the region. Because two-party competition and a real contest of ideas holds politicians accountable. It keeps the electorate invested. It makes it a politics of problem-solving and deliverables and not just personality, whether it was one-party Democrat or one-party Republican. In Georgia, I think what they're doing is building a truly empowered, strong party option for the Democrats, and they're going to have a lot of elections that are going to be really close. For a while, you're not going to see an entirely blue Georgia state legislature. You're going to see real two-party competition. And I think the state of Georgia is going to benefit from that.
Okay. So there you have the past and going up to some of the questions that we have had about what's going on in Georgia. Okay. And this article was from Facing South, a voice for a changing South, and this is defending democracy in the South. Okay. So I had one more article, and this one was by Princeton Economics, and why did the Democrats lose the South, bringing new data to an old debate. And this basically goes into, and I'm not going to go ahead and do it, but this goes into some of the data that has been recently released that basically shows why people voted the way that they did. A lot of the polling data from that time was not made available. A lot of the census data was not made available. Well, all of that's been made available now, and it all led in one direction, and that was that the reason why people changed their affiliation was because of civil rights legislation. They felt like civil rights was being pushed too fast, that that they did not support the black people being integrated into society. And as you can see from the other articles that I presented, all of the evidence points in one direction. So for those of you who are trying to make the argument that we need to support the Republican Party, if you're going to do that, hey, that's your vote. But if you're going to do it based off of real information, real historical information, facts, data, and statistics, and be willing to deal with the ramifications of your vote. If in the event that the Republicans win with the support of blacks who basically go over to their side, and things become remarkably worse, destructively worse, not only for black people, but for the entire country, be willing to stand on that. That's all I'm saying. Be willing to stand on that. I can't say that I don't care which way you vote, because I do care about politics in this country. I served my country. I know how politics is supposed to work. I spent the better half of my adult life studying politics and history, among other things. And for people to come out, especially young people to come out and talk about the sacrifices that black people made as if they were nothing, and to talk about politics in a way that is just totally naive, is disheartening. You have these people on TikTok who are basically saying things like, black folks, Democrats still democrating and all of that, and that the stuff is, it is definitely disheartening, and it makes us look ignorant. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end this. I'm going to put all of this into the comments. And this book, I did want you guys to get this book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican. And this was during that time in the 60s. It will tell you what was on their minds, why they felt so lonely as black Republicans, because of the alienation of ideas that were beneficial to them. So, yeah. So I am going to bid you guys a good night, good evening, good day, whenever you listen to this. And I appreciate you guys coming over to the channel and, listening. Some of these, I can't make short because there's just so much information that needs to be covered. And you guys be smart, man. Don't be snookered into making decisions that are not beneficial to you. Appreciate you guys, and I'm out.